Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 162, The Horden Family. Part 1. I came across an article on Samuel Horden in 1909 and it stated he was an Australian millionaire. It says, in connection with the death of Mr. Sam Horden of Sydney, it is stated that in addition to his business, which was worth $1.5 million at any time as the buildings and stock stood, he was the owner of a vast amount of Sydney property. It is a matter of common repute that in his enormous and varied business transactions, Mr. Horden did not know what property he owned. It is reputed that in one suburb alone, Newtown, he owned 500 homes. He was probably the biggest landlord in New South Wales. In all probability, an estimate recently made by an intimate friend of Mr. Horden said that he was a millionaire quite 3 times over, and it would be found to be by no means extravagant estimate of his wealth. In fact, some estimates have reached it as far as 8 or 9 million. So how did Samuel Horden create his wealth, and what is his family background? So little did I know what an illustrious family Samuel Horden belonged to until I delved into them, and Samuel certainly wasn't the only successful businessman and very rich man out of the family. To have a full understanding of where the success of the Horden family originated, I'll firstly cover Samuel's paternal grandparents and then cover their children in order of their birth. Samuel was one of the children of the firstborn twins, Anthony Horden Jr. So Samuel's grandfather was Anthony Horden. He was born in 1788 at Stramshall, Staffordshire, England. He married Anne Woodhead, who was born in 1794 in Nottinghamshire, England. His family were a banking family from Staffordshire. They disapproved of Anthony's marriage to Anne, and they migrated on the Phoenix, arriving in Sydney in March 1825. Anthony Horden set himself up as a coachmaker, a wheelwright and a smith, and later a grocer and publican. Anne opened her own shop as a haberdasher and bonnet and corset maker, and her success provoked a rumour that Horden was her assigned convict. In 1839, Anthony bought 3 lots in Melbourne and later settled there. He died in Melbourne on the 9th of June 1869 at the age of 81, and Anne died on the 18th of January 1871, aged 77, at Darling Point, New South Wales. Anthony and Anne had 6 children, and as mentioned, their firstborn were twin boys. The firstborn was John Horden, on the 6th of July 1819 at Bethnal Green in Middlesex, England. He married Rebecca Carr on the 5th of July 1845 at St Andrew's Church in Sydney when John was 25 and Rebecca 18. Rebecca had been born at Bethnal Green, London on the 4th of June 1827. She was the daughter of John Carr, who was convicted at Middlesex for a term of 14 years. He was 38 at the time of his conviction with a family of 3. He was a tin brazier and he robbed an employee. He left England on the ship Catherine Stewart Forbes on the 7th of October 1829 and arrived in New South Wales on the 18th of February 1830. In 1835, he requested permission to marry a Jane Green, but was denied. His wife and girls must have arrived in Australia by 1835, as this is when their son James was born. Rebecca's father received his certificate of freedom in June 1843. John Horden died on the 27th of March 1864 at the age of only 44 at Newtown in New South Wales, and he is buried with his infant son William Carr, and his grave was relocated to the Gore Hill Cemetery in 1948. The headstone is now in poor condition and barely legible. How did John Horden, the firstborn, die? Well, in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 28th of March 1864, it outlines the reason. Distressing suicide. Yesterday, Mr. John Horden of Newtown died at the drapery establishment of his brothers, L and E Horden, Brickfield Hill, under circumstances of a very distressing nature.
The facts of the case are understood to be these. About 11:15 yesterday morning, Mr. L. Horden's attention was arrested by his hearing a confused noise coming from the bedroom where his deceased brother was, and on going there he was horrified to find him lying on the floor, weltering in his blood. When Mr. Horden had somewhat recovered from the consternation of which he had been thrown, he immediately sent for medical aid, and in the absence of Dr. McPhee, who lives next door, a gentleman from his dispensary at once repaired to the room. It was found that the deceased had cut his throat with a razor, which was lying near. Mr. Horden, who was not unconscious, was placed on a bed, and in a short time Doctors O'Brien, Bland and Eichler, who had been sent for, were in attendance. To avert the fatal efforts of the wound was seen to be impossible, but all that could be done to prolong life and afford relief to the sufferer was effected. The deceased lingered until 2:30 p.m, where he expired. And Rebecca Horden died on the 15th of July 1875, only at the age of 48 at Newtown. It's only 11 years after the death of her husband. John and Rebecca Horden had 5 children, 4 of whom survived infancy. Their firstborn was John Labaeus Horden, who was born on the 2nd of July 1848 in Sydney. In a newspaper article, it says that John L. Horden, E. Carr Horden and Alfred J. Horden, trading as Horden brothers in Pitt Street in Sydney, drapers and clothiers. So 3 brothers went into business together. Now, this was quite successful. At one stage, they employed 750 people and they had buying offices in London and France. John Labaeus Horden died on the 23rd of February 1910 at the age of 61 in Auckland, New Zealand, and is buried at the Gore Hill Cemetery in Sydney. He did not marry. The announcement in the paper, death of Mr. John Horden. Mr. John Horden, principal of the firm Horden Brothers in Pitt Street, Sydney, went on a holiday trip to New Zealand 6 weeks ago, fell off a horse and broke his leg. He contracted pneumonia and he died at Auckland on Wednesday night. The late Mr. Horden was a brother of Mr. E. Carr Horden and Alfred J. Horden. The flourishing business in Sydney was established by him, and its wonderful success in a large measure is the fruit of his careful organisation and management. Frankness and cheerfulness were particular characteristics of the deceased. The great number of employees who came within the sphere of his control received abundant proofs of his good nature and kindly consideration. To many on whom the darkness of adversity has fallen, the late Mr. Horden was a true friend and a kindly adviser. His benefactions were innumerable and radiated throughout the state. His passing away leaves Sydney minus of a good and honourable citizen, a man who was firm in his friendships, generous, genial and kind to all, and possessing all the bright qualities which constitute a gentleman. His good acts in life will commend his name to memory. And on the 4th of June 1910 his probate was granted. The net value of his estate was sworn in at £74,615, of which £19,016 was represented as real estate. He appointed his brothers, Edward Carr Horden and Alfred James Horden, and his sister, Ada Rebecca Horden, as trustees and executors of his estate. He empowered his trustees to sell, call in and convert into money the real and personal estate and have discretionary power to postpone any sale or conversion that they thought fit. He stated that it would be lawful for the trustees to concur in winding up the business of the Horden brothers, in which he was a partner, subject to the terms of the partnership, or if they thought desirable to enter into a new arrangement with respect to the said business. He directed the trustees to stand possessed of the monies arising from his estate, and to hold the same upon trust as to 3 equal 1/6 parts for his brother Edward Carr Horden absolutely, 2 equal 1/6 parts for his brother Alfred James Horden absolutely, and the remaining 1/6 part for his sister Ada Rebecca Horden. As to his sister's share, the testator directed that she should receive the income of it for life, and after her death the capital as well as the interest to be passed on to her children. In the event of her dying without children, the share was to be divided between his 2 brothers in equal portions. So their next son was Edward Carr Horden. He was born on the 23rd of November 1853 in Sydney. He married Frances Lily Dryland on the 14th of October 1885 at St George, Hanover Square in London when he was 31 and Frances 18. Frances had been born in London. They had 6 children and lived in Chatswood, New South Wales. And on the 9th of June 1922, notice is hereby given that the partnership existing between Edward Carr Horden and Alfred James Horden, trading as Horden Brothers in Pitt Street, Sydney, has been dissolved by mutual consent. and arrangements have been made with Horden Brothers Limited, who have taken over the business. This will be carried on in Pitt Street, Sydney. So basically the first-born child of the family, John Horden's children, had their own branch of drapery business, and then you'll soon discover that there is another branch of the Horden children that had their own successful business, and that was the Horden Brothers Limited that's been referred to that bought them out. And a reference to Edward Carr Horden, one of the strongest links to the business life of old Sydney, is still a young man mentally. Edward Carr Horden was born over his father's business in George Street and has been in business ever since. As managing director of Horden Brothers of Pitt Street, he's seen the business life of Sydney undergo many changes from the days when he advertised on a dray drawn through the streets by a bullock team. After being educated at Camden College, he learnt the rudiments of a drapery business in the warehouse of Christopher Newton and Company. That site's now absorbed by his own emporium. 50 years strict attention to business and about 30-odd trips to London and the continent in search for goods to sell have affected the change. His 3 sons carry on big business, which E. Carr has done so much to build up, but he still knows everything that goes on in Pitt Street. Edward Carr Horden died on the 24th of July 1940 at Chatswood at the age of 86. The third child was Eda Rebecca Horden. She was born in 1854 in Sydney. She did not marry or have children and died in 1922 at her residence Tummel in Cleveland Street, Wahroonga, when she was 66. The fourth child was Alfred James Horden, who was born in Sydney in 1859. He married Caroline Doig in 1890 when he was 31 and Caroline 20, and they had 2 sons. And he died on the 15th of August 1932 in Sydney, aged 73. And an article stated Mr. A.J. Horden of Highlands, Waitara, died at his home on Monday. Mr. Horden was at one time associated with the firm now known as Horden Brothers Limited. He retired many years ago and built a home in the centre of a miniature forest of gum trees where he devoted himself to the culture of rare and beautiful flowers, which he collected on extensive tours abroad. AJ, as he was known to his friends, was the kindliest and most humorous of men. All he asked in his latter days was to be left alone to enjoy life at Waitara, in a great circle he had cut from the original bushlands where there was privacy, prettiness and peace. Their second child, Anthony Horden, was Samuel Horden's father, and he was born as a twin on the 6th of July 1819 at Bethnal Green, Middlesex, England. Anthony was educated by John Dunmore Lang, and he went to Melbourne in 1839 from Sydney, and he set up shop on land owned by his father in Little Collins Street, Melbourne, and on the 4th of May his first advertisement appeared in the Port Phillip Gazette. Sydney House, A. Horden. Having commenced business as linen draper and haberdasher, with a choice of assortment of goods and being connected with the well-known establishment of the same name in King Street, Sydney, is able to supply superior articles and the latest London fashions at the lowest possible prices. A. Horden hopes by assiduous attention to the wants of his customers to meet with a share of public patronage. A liberal allowance is made to shopkeepers. Little Collins Street, next door to Mr. McLean's store. Sydney House sounds rather grand. However, as the sale at which the site was bought had taken place less than 7 weeks before the business opened, and a further 2 weeks passed before Anthony arrived in Melbourne to supervise or to perhaps undertake for himself the construction of the building, it seems likely that Sydney House was a little more than a skilling, such as his father Anthony had occupied for his liquor store in George Street 10 years before. This instability was characteristic not only of the buildings in which the early Melbourne businesses were housed. Shops and offices mushroomed overnight and disappeared without a trace, as did their occupants. A week after Anthony's advertisement appeared, Sydney House gained a second tenant, James Purvis, who, in addition to his profession as architect and surveyor, was a licensed auctioneer. 2 weeks later, Purvis was gone, and Thomas Wells, tailor and breeches maker, occupied the house. It is possible that Anthony's occupancy of Sydney House was also brief. The shipping notices for July 1840 list a Mr. Horden as a passenger returning from London on the barque Lavinia. The other adult males of the family, with the exception of John, can be accounted for during the year preceding this date. Since it became his parents' practice to send each of their sons abroad, it seems probable that this was Anthony who, as the firstborn, would have been the first to go. Later in the same year he returned to the drapery trade in Melbourne, this time in one of his father's properties in Russell Street. On the 17th of July 1841 at Windsor, New South Wales, he married Harriet Marsden, a daughter of Samuel Marsden, a tanner, not the Reverend Samuel Marsden that we all know of from our Australian history. However, they are connected. They had 6 children, and Samuel was their 4th child. And it says, Master Tanner Samuel Marsden's daughter, Miss Harriet Marsden, became the second and Australian ancestress of the Horderns of Palace Emporium fame, being married at St Matthew's Church, Windsor, to Anthony Horden II on July 17, 1841. In 1842, Anthony became a town councillor, and in about 1844, he returned to Sydney with his brother Labaeus, opening a drapery on Brickfield Hill. In 1855, Anthony also started a business on his own in the Haymarket district, and this was the beginning of Anthony Horden's, the largest department store in Sydney. A further large menswear store was in Upper George Street, and Horden's also operated one of the largest mail order businesses in Australia. In 1864, his son-in-law Henry Bull and the next year his eldest son Anthony III became partners in the firm. In 1869, his second son Samuel replaced Bull and the firm became Anthony Horden and Sons. In 1878, Horden and his brother Samuel signed a formal deed of partnership for 30 years, and according to the Bulletin on the 22nd of May 1880, they fairly ruled the retail trade of the metropolis and the colony in general. In 1878, Anthony visited America and London, and in 1879 he opened the Palace Warehouse and the Palace Emporium in Haymarket. In 1881 and 1882 he opened offices in Britain, the continent, America and China. Interested in Western Australia, he put to the Colonial Office in 1873 a scheme for 10,000 settlers, and in 1883 proposed to the Legislative Council of a land grant railway. Later, he formed a syndicate in England to construct the line and encourage migration. The Palace Emporium was a huge 6-storey building that was opened in 1905, the main entrance being completely fitted out in imported Italian marble. The massive store was located on the corners of George, Pitt and Goulburn Streets in the southern end of the CBD. One of their advertising slogans was that they sold anything from a needle to an anchor. The crest on their coat of arms was a budding tree with the motto, "While I live, I grow." It appeared above all the store's window fittings and on all their stationery. By the early 1960s, Anthony Horden and Sons began to accumulate yearly losses instead of profits. By 1965 and 1966, these losses became noticeable and restructuring was underway. Most notable were the losses from the Brickfield Hill flagship store and the Anthony Horden store in Wollongong. By mid-1969, the situation had not improved and it was dire. Things came to a head and drastic action was needed. Waltons launched a bid for the retail operations of Anthony Horden's and succeeded in gaining control of the company during late 1869, and the takeover was completed in 1970. There were a development of American-style suburban shopping malls popping up in the late 1960s, coupled with fiercer competition in the city, and this seemed to have sealed the fate of the store. And mysteriously, the tree on the Horden's family estate at Camden, New South Wales, upon which the idea of the crest was based, died soon afterwards. And on the 28th of May 1974, it says, "Horden tree, while I live, I'll grow," from the Sydney Morning Herald. The gale over the weekend destroyed the famous Anthony Horden tree, the 109-year-old Port Jackson fig that became the landmark on the Razorback Mountain near Picton. For many years, Anthony Horden and Sons Limited used the tree to symbolise the motto of their store, "While I live, I'll grow." The company was taken over in April 1970 by Waltons after almost 44 years as a public company. One remaining Horden's shop remained open in Windsor, New South Wales until at least 1986, and it included the old glass top display cabinets. In about 1860, Anthony built Retford Hall on Darling Point. Anthony also speculated in city real estate and in 1869 won the Philip Ward in the City Council. His wife Harriet, on the 21st of January at Genoa, Italy, returning homeward to Australia from England, died at the age of 51, and that was in 1872. In St Matthew's Church of England in Windsor, there was a glorious stained glass window to the memory of Harriet Horden, and it says, "To the honour and glory of God, the window is erected by Anthony Horden of Sydney in memory of his beloved wife Harriet Horden, returning homeward to Australia from England." Her grave in Italy no longer exists, and this memorial window in Windsor was suggested after the church said they could not accommodate a marble memorial that her husband had brought back from Italy. That marble memorial is actually at St James's Church in Phillip Street, Sydney, And it says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints, erected in memory of Harriet Horden by her loving husband and children." With the death of Harriet, Anthony's good fortune left him. His own life was now virtually at an end. He returned sadly home to Retford House, where he lingered for another 4 years, but at the age of only 53, his buoyancy deserted him. He has been known to have said, "I have been so distressed since arriving in Sydney that I dare not venture out to see you." And he wrote this to his sister-in-law Rebecca in March 1872. He said, "I'm in great trouble, broken-hearted and very despondent." Soon other troubles were pressing on him. His relationship with his son-in-law Henry Bull had been unfriendly for several years. He'd taken Bull into Anthony Horden's as a partner in 1865, but Bull had left the firm several years later, and a rift between them seems to have dated about that time. After Anthony's return to Sydney, this rift widened, and it was the opinion of the family that Anthony was greatly to blame for this. Edward Carr Horden, writing to his brother John of Family Affairs in 1875, told him, "Uncle Abaeus almost said that there was likely to be a separation between Henry Bull and his wife if the old jackass of an uncle of ours does not stop his humbug." Early in 1876, Anthony moved out of Retford Hall and returned to live in his old home at the original store in the Haymarket. Possibly suffering from depression, which had stricken his twin brother John, he'd apparently been unable or disinclined to resume management of the store after returning from England, and it was now virtually in the hands of his son, Anthony III, and his other son, Samuel. The shop remained his refuge, and it was noted that Uncle Anthony sits in the shop to amuse himself on and off during the week. Anthony died on the 21st of August 1876 at the age of 57 in Sydney, and his probate said that Anthony Horden, Draper of Sydney, has left £125,000 in cash to be divided amongst his relatives. There are still some legacies of Anthony Horden, such as the Horden Pavilion and the Horden Towers within the World Square development. Anthony's children, his firstborn was Anthony Horden III, and he was born on the 24th of July 1842 in Melbourne. He was educated in Sydney and then in Rugby, England, and he toured Europe, and at 18 he entered his father's firm. Shoeburgh Hall was the home of Anthony Horden until 1889, and it's one of the oldest buildings in Sydney and is now under the Presbyterian Ladies' College in Croydon. He married Elizabeth Bull in Sydney on the 12th of October 1864, and they had 12 children, with 5 surviving childhood. Anthony Horden III died on the 16th of September 1886 at sea on board the RMS Carthage, midway between Ceylon and Western Australia, when he was only 43. And in a publication called Australian Men of Mark, it says, "Perhaps the event in Mr. Horden's life which showed most clearly his breadth of mind, his great activity and his large business capacity was the magnificent project he carried to such a successful issue in Western Australia. That country will owe more of her future prosperity to Mr. Anthony Horden than the present generation is capable of appreciating." Mr. Horden, anxious to give an impetus to business and eager to develop the grand resources in the neglected and comparatively known land, he submitted to the Government of Western Australia a gigantic scheme of railway construction on the land grant system. After contending successfully with many difficulties, both in Australia and London, and being opposed by some Western Australians, he concluded his negotiations, and on the 25th of October 1884, he signed a contract for the Albany-Beverley Railroad. By this contract, he undertook to construct a railroad from Albany to Beverley, a distance of 234 miles. He received a grant of 12,000 acres of land in alternate blocks for every mile of railroad, and was allowed to select the same in a belt of 80 miles running east and west of the line. He was also bound to introduce 5,000 immigrants into the colony at a rate of 1,000 a year for 5 years. In connection with this scheme, Mr. Horden proceeded to England in 1884, as also to attend the needs of his Haymarket business, of which, it must be remembered, he was the buyer. On his return to Western Australia in 1886, he succumbed while on board the P&O Carthage in the Indian Ocean with an attack of sunstroke, which he sustained at Aden. In the Albany Mail of the 22nd of September 1886, there appeared a long obituary notice of the deceased gentleman, in which many of his good actions were set forth, and it concluded with these words: "It does not seem strange that the inscrutable decrees of Providence should have willed that this enterprising and energetic man should have been called away to another world just on the eve of the triumph of one of the great objects of his life, and only within a few days' sail of the place which was to be so greatly benefited by the grand undertaking of which he preeminently was the promoter. The friend of Western Australia, the saviour of Albany and district, Mr. Horden's memory deserves to be perpetuated in a manner worthy of his enterprising exertions for the benefit of the colony." and we trust that some steps will be taken to erect a monument to hand down to posterity the name of Mr. Anthony Horden as benefactor of this port. His large and thriving business will be carried on for the benefit of his two sons, who, as they come of age, will enter into the business. His daughters he has otherwise well provided for, but they, with their brothers, still have their father's interest in the Albany-Beverley Railroad. Mr. Horden was a kind husband and a loving and indulgent father, while his geniality made him a favourite amongst those that he had the pleasure of his friendship. The memorial before alluded to is an eloquent tribute to his work and speaks in no doubtful terms of the uniform kindness shown to his subordinates and the anxious solicitude he always displayed in their advancement and welfare. His name will ever remain as that of one who has given an example to be followed and who has helped make Australia the great nation that she promises to become at no very distant date. So there is a handsome monument of Scottish granite that stands at the top of York Street at the junction with the Perth Road and Middleton Road as a fitting tribute of work of Anthony Horden. Anthony Horden II's second child was Harriet Horden, who was born on the 7th of March 1844 in Melbourne. She married Nathaniel George Frederick Bull on the 9th of February 1861 in Sydney when she was 16 and Nathaniel 18. They had 15 children with 7 surviving childhood. Nathaniel Bull died in 1911 at his residence Lugano in Potts Point at the age of 69. He was the son of John Bull of Cabramatta, and his sister was Anthony Horden III's wife. And it says that he served his apprenticeship under the late Mr. Anthony Horden Sr., and he was a brother of Mr. Henry Bull of York Street, Sydney, and Mrs. Anthony Horden and the late Mrs. Neal, under whose will he was a beneficiary. He carried on business in George Street, Sydney for several years, after which he had a large storekeeping business at Liverpool, and he took a leading part in public affairs and occupied the position of mayor for some years. He was one of the pioneers of port hacking, where he established a beautiful home called Burraneer. One of his sons, Lewis Bull, succeeded him in the storekeeping business at Liverpool and is still the respected head of the flourishing establishment. And that's the son-in-law that was referred to earlier about coming to head with Charles Horden II. And Harriet died on the 24th of August 1904 at Cabramatta Park, Liverpool, aged 60. Charles II's third child was Hannah Horden, who was born on the 2nd of May 1846 in Sydney. She married Henry Bull, so another brother. So we had 3 children of the Horden family marry 3 children of the Bull family. And they married on the 29th of November 1862 at the Christ Church of St Lawrence in Railway Square, Sydney, when she was 16 and Henry 18. They had 6 children, and by 1881 they moved to London, and Hannah died in London on the 16th of September 1884 in Islington, aged only 35. And the fourth child was Samuel, and he was born on the 14th of July 1849 in Sydney. He was educated at Fort Street School and Camden College, and he joined his father's firm at the age of 17, and in 1886 paid £158,252 for Anthony's share, becoming the sole proprietor of Anthony Horden and Sons, Universal Providers, Palace Emporium and Haymarket only, to distinguish it from 5 other competing Horden shops in Sydney. On the 10th of July 1901, fire destroyed all of the Haymarket complex, but Samuel leased the exhibition building and opened there the next day. In 1905, he had the new premises on Brickfield Hill. He was generous to his staff of over 4,000 and provided a cafeteria and other amenities. City and suburban land speculation added to his wealth, and his success brought comments on his glorified sock-selling and insolent monopoly. Samuel married Jane Maria Booth in 1875 in Paddington when Jane was 17 and Samuel 26. Jane had been born in 1858 at Milton, New South Wales. She was the daughter of John Booth, an Englishman who'd arrived in 1849, and he was a produce merchant, and his wife, Sarah Ann Marie Smith, was Irish. Samuel gave privately to many charities. He was a Federalist and an Imperialist, and he gave £10,000 to the Dreadnought Fund. In 1892, he was a Commodore of the Prince Alfred Yacht Club and was an active member of the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron. His love of the country led him in the 1880s to buy Wilton Park, Picton, and in 1887 to build Retford Park near Bowral, where he bred Jersey and Ayrshire cattle. After winning the Sydney Cup in 1893 with Realm and the Metropolitan in 1896 with the Skipper, he concentrated on breeding horses. He kept homing pigeons and was vice president of the Royal Agricultural Society. And Samuel died at Darling Point on the 13th of August 1909. He was survived by 4 of his 5 sons and 4 daughters, and in 1910 his estate was worth £2.925 million and was upheld by the Privy Council after two sons of Anthony tried to upset the 1878 deed of partnership. His eldest son, Sir Samuel, became governing director of Anthony Horden and Sons when it was made a private company in 1912. And in the Sydney Morning Herald, the announcement of his death: Mr. Samuel Horden, unexpected death, a great Australian businessman, history of notable career. Mr. Samuel Horden, principal of the firm of Anthony Horden and Sons, Sydney, died shortly after 4 p.m. yesterday at his residence, Darling Point. For some time past, Mr. Horden has been in bad health. Within the last 12 months, he had a return trip to England, taken in order to gain the benefit of the change. The results were not, however, up to the anticipations, and he recently had projected a tour of Japan and the East with a party. The passages had been booked, but Mr. Horden became ill again and a minor operation was found to be necessary. This was within a month of his death. The operation was successfully performed and he was fairly well until about 3 or 4 days ago, though not able to leave his residence. His health then took a worse turn. The end was a peaceful one. Mr. Horden married the daughter of one of the founders of Milton on the south coast, and Mrs. Horden is now at the Darling Point residence. On the spot which now stands the famous Emporium, Mr. Horden was born in 1849, his father living there. He was educated at Camden College, and in 1886, on the death in Western Australia of his brother Anthony, with whom he had been running the business, he became a sole proprietor. Australian by birth, he was thoroughly Australian in sentiment. He believed in things Australian, and particularly in the state of which he was a citizen. In its possibilities, he had unbounded faith, and he backed that belief by his investments. He held ever the view that Sydney is destined to be a great city of the Southern Hemisphere, and he acquired large holdings here. Notwithstanding his vast interests, however, he shrank from obtruding himself in public affairs. The great light that shone on the firm of Anthony Horden and Sons, with its widespread hold of the people of the Commonwealth, was never allowed to be cast upon the man. He shrank from publicity and took no active part in politics or municipal affairs. Although what might be called, with the fullest justification for the use of the term, a merchant prince, he directed his abilities and his keen insight and business acumen to the direction of the mammoth hive of throbbing trade under his hand, and would never allow himself to appear on directorates of companies. He was perhaps less in the public eye than any of the Sydney merchants, although the head of one of the largest of commercial enterprises in the world. When he was in partnership with his brother, he was bold, paradoxical as it may seem, in the face of a retiring nature. Mr. Anthony Horden was more inclined in cautious policy. Mr. Samuel Horden would make up his mind quickly, and things would be done, generally the right thing too. He lived to see the firm of Anthony Horden and Sons for a time, being the largest of its kind in existence. When the young men of the family began to take part in the control of it, the fusion of new blood soon began to make itself felt. It was in 1856 that the first Haymarket building was erected. Working hours in those days were from 7 in the morning until 8 at night, but Mr. Samuel Horden brought about immediate alteration in that respect as soon as he was admitted to active administration. Despite the opposition of many advisers, he introduced the Saturday half-holiday, and he rigidly adhered to it. As an instance of prompt business capacity and the faculty of immediately dealing with a difficult situation, the events of the Great Fire have only to be recalled when the premises of the Emporium was devastated and customers were being served the next morning in the exhibition building while the fire was still raging. The present building was Australian designed, Australian built, and composed as far as possible of Australian material. In this, as in all things, he promoted the interests of his native land. There are many people who will have reason to regret his death. Today the firm employs more than 3,500 to 4,000 persons. Although there was not much heard of his acts of charity, Mr. Horden gave very largely, and he seemed to do his best to keep it from being known. Every year thousands of pounds were sent out in various directions in good cause. One instance is yet fresh, a gift of 10,000 bags of wheat to the Japanese sufferers from famine. A patriot, he put his name down for £10,000 as a contribution towards the Dreadnought Fund, with an additional offer of a similar sum if occasion should arise. Mr. Horden had long been prominent in yachting circles. He was a member of the Royal Alfred Yacht Club, the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron, and several sailing clubs. He joined the Prince Alfred Yacht Club in 1873 and in 1892 was appointed Commodore, a position that he held for 13 years. Throughout his membership, he played an active part in the sport and was a liberal donor of trophies. In 1898, he presented for competition a 100-guinea silver cup, which was the subject of many keen races. Mr. Horden's first yacht was the Meteor, but later he imported the steam yacht Bronzewing, and in 1892, with Mr. J.O. Fairfax's Bulbul, was looked upon as the most modern yacht on the harbour and had beaten all comers. Mr. Horden had Fife, the great English designer, planned for him a yacht also known as Bronzewing, after which a series of interesting races beat the Bulbul. His next yacht was White Wings, a fine type of boat with a larger tonnage, and later on Fife designed and Ford of Berries Bay built for him the Fleetwing, which proved to be one of the most successful yachts on Port Jackson. For many years, Mr. Horden delighted in close association with the members of the yacht clubs to which he belonged, and he spared no effort to contribute to their enjoyment. Some of the Prince Alfred Yacht Club functions at Retford Hall were historic, and the club's success was largely due to his support. For a number of years, he was a prominent figure in the connection with the turf, but eventually retired from active participation in the sport, confining his energies to stud farms. His first connection with the turf was when he bought Nordenfelt and established the Wilton Park stud in the Mossvale district. The stud comprised of a number of high-class thoroughbred mares. He had a number of horses in training, and though he raced with varied success, he captured very few of the big events. A large number of the classic events have been captured by horses bred on his farm. He had great pride in his horseflesh and bred all the stock that is employed in the business of the firm, taking a personal interest in the stables. Many of the best carriage horses seen about Sydney have been broken into work in them. Another of his hobbies was that of homing pigeons. He was one of the original importers of the birds into Australia and took the greatest interest in flying right up until the last. A very big loft of pigeons is installed at Darling Point, and out of it have come participants in many matches, including flies from Melbourne to Sydney, as well as other intermediate distances. He was also a breeder of dairy stock, jerseys and Ayrshires in particular, at his country residence at Bowral, and he was president of the Automobile Club of Australasia, and among his business interests he held office as president of the Master Retailers Association. And the funeral of Samuel Horden was attended by an immense concourse. The cortege was representative of the commercial, civil, professional and sporting life in the community. Tens of thousands of people lined the route to the railway station, and the number at Rookwood Cemetery was about 3,000, including a large number of the firm's employees. His wife Jane died on the 19th of October 1945 at the age of 87. In the next episode, I'll be covering Samuel and Jane Horden's children, as well as the other members of the patriarch, Anthony Horden Sr.'s family.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.